So if you're like me, you've been learning Unity this summer and you are suddenly thinking about other options. And I have also been learning Godot. So today I want to show some of what I've learned between the two and discuss some of the similarities and the differences. This is meant to be for beginners, and I'm going to more focus on some concepts and things that you need to use in Godot compared to how you'd use them in Unity. And this is more high level as opposed to getting deep into the weeds. So the first thing to talk about here are scenes. So looking here in Unity, you'll notice I have a few different scenes. I have one for the actual game scene, I have a loading scene, and I have a main menu scene. So if I go and I double click the main menu scene, this is really what I'm ultimately looking at. If I go to the game screen here, this is what I kind of see. Scenes tend to be something in Unity where they're a level or a particular menu, something like that. That's what they often are. As a note, I'll be using the GDScript version of Godot. There is a .NET version that I intend to look into more because I've learned a lot more C# since I started messing with Godot. And I do like the stronger typing. I am going to include a link to a resource I found that was specifically about the C# version of Godot. I'm going to include that and a couple of other links that I found helpful as I've kind of decided to go back into Godot more since my earlier time with it this summer. In Godot, scenes can be used in a similar way. This is a level from a Game Jam game that I did over the summer. This was my first Game Jam game. So, you know, if it's not all that greatly organized, that's okay. Level 2 here is its own scene, but it also has different things in it. Like it has multiple other scenes being loaded into it. And you can see here, like there's a death plane scene, and a player scene, and a stage goal scene, and a pause menu scene. There are multiple scenes stacked here, and the scenes are really meant to be nested. So the scenes in Godot tend to be a lot more granular than they are. And one example of that is you're often gonna see somebody have a player scene. And so it may have a player and it'll have a sprite. The player, by the way, is a character body 2D. We're gonna touch on that momentarily a little bit more when we talk about some of the differences here. But I think of it kind of like a scene in Godot is kind of like a cross between a scene in Unity and a prefab in Unity. There are other ways that you can do some kind of prefab-like things in Godot, which we're gonna touch on briefly, but this is what I tend to think of when it comes to a scene in Godot is I tend to think of one particular thing. So like the actual player scene here, the only elements unique to the player scene are from here to here. This hitbox and this hurtbox are actually different scenes. The point being that here, this is a player scene. And this is not something typically that you would do in Unity. There might be situations that you could do it though. But when I hear people talk about scenes in Unity, I don't hear them going as granular as a player. So let's talk about scriptable objects. So scriptable objects are something that is very powerful in Unity. Here's a quick example of what this particular scriptable object is from. This is from the Unity Code Monkey, his 11-hour tutorial. And this is where it's essentially combining these things to become an item. This is becoming a scriptable object. This would be a kitchen object, scriptable object. And so it's looking for a transform, in this case, a prefab in particular, and a sprite, and a string. And I'm going to try to pull this up in Unity. The text is very tiny for some reason. But you'll notice here we have a bunch of different kitchen object SOs. And so like if I check one of these, you'll notice here I have those items assigned. And so that's really where scriptable objects can be really nice is items like this where you have a bunch of the same type of thing that needs the same thing. And Godot has something very similar, though as I understand it, I think it can actually do even more than that. And it's called a resource. This is something I kind of threw together for this video. I am not as familiar with resources, so after learning what I did about scriptable objects, I do intend to look further into these. I could theoretically create this as a stat sheet and use this for different characters. So I could have other variables here like export, let's say like a variable of attack. And I can make that an int. I could export a variable of defense, and I could make that an int. And so what I could do is I could, I could have a bunch of, say for if I was making an RPG, I could then take this and attach this to all of my playable characters so that all of them had the same stats to go by. I could also potentially use this as the base stats for an enemy stats resource, and I could put enemy stats on it. You could divide this up however you liked. You can also inherit from this. So if I wanted to make something that inherits from stat sheet, I could do that. In addition to variables, you can also set things like setter functions, getter functions, and these are just examples, by the way. You can create any type of functions you need to. You can also create signals. So one signal, maybe you could say like, let's say if I wanted to have a signal for stats changed, and I could do something like that. And so once the set health was run, I could actually say stats changed dot emit, and maybe I had like a UI subscribe to that to make sure that the UI got updated as needed. But yes, resources can be something that can be very powerful. I'd recommend trying to get to learn those as you go. I did find a pretty nice little tutorial on these. It's from Godot 3.5, but the principles are the same. So I'm going to link that down in the description. So yes, I would highly encourage you, if you were going to be doing anything with Godot, I would highly encourage you to start working on learning these resources. And I will be including a link or two below about getting to know resources, because I do think they're going to be very useful after seeing how useful they were. Scriptable objects rather were in Unity. Another thing that can be really nice for scriptable objects and resources as well is if you use these to let a designer update some of this data for these export variables. Speaking of export variables, one of the key things you need to do often in Unity is have a variable available in the inspector. So let's take a quick look at that in Unity, and then I will come back to Godot and you can see how that's done. So here in Unity, we're looking back at this player script again, and these serialized fields here, these will all be showing up in the actual inspector. So if I go to the player and inspector, you'll see the items over here, just like we saw for the scriptable object. And the export variables here, that's what we'll see in Godot. And so if I go to, for example, I think my player may have some. Yeah, you can see my player has some. So let's go to the player scene. So here in my player scene, you'll notice over here on the right, I go back to the script, you'll see export, 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 and you'll see all of these values over here on the right, just like they would be if I made them public in Unity, or if I put these into a serialized field in Unity. I need to, again, confirm what these actually look like when it comes to the C# version. I think it's probably going to be something similar, but yeah, it's as easy as that. Export. The other thing to note here is onReady. So onReady means that that variable will be generated when the scene is ready. Sometimes you'll see a function of _ready. That just means that is similar to start. I don't know if there's something like awake. I don't know which one this would be closer to, but this is called when the node enters the scene. And that's the key thing here, is which we're going to talk about a little bit later, is a node. The process function down here is very similar to the update function in Unity. And then the physics process function right here is similar to the physics one in Unity as well. So the fixed update rather in Unity. So that's just something to keep in mind. It's kind of transferable. Delta, very similar to time.delta time, same thing, same idea. That ultimately, that's what you're using to kind of balance it out. Singletons are another area where you have some options in both. Let's take a quick look at Unity just as a reminder, and then we will get to Godot. So here in Unity, we have this player, and we have instanced the player. We've made it a static instance and have a public set and a public get rather, and a private set. And so down here where on awake, we are setting this as an instance. And essentially, we are making the player a singleton that can be accessed from anywhere else in the code. Godot, it's a little bit different, but again, similar idea. I have switched over to a template project. I will have the link for this one again down in the pinned comment. But in Godot, you need to go to project settings, and then go to auto load. and then you will see any particular singletons that have been set up. And so we have a couple here. Let's open up the globals. That's a script. So let's open up the global script. And so this is how we set up a singleton. You'll notice there's really not anything different here. There's nothing special calling this out. It's simply because this is auto-loaded on the start of the engine, like on the start of the game. So it's really simple to create some of these and then go into your project settings and load these automatically. There are instances where it may make more sense to do a singleton versus a resource, but a resource is another great option for this. So I would personally really learn a bit about which one of these might be the better option, resource or singleton, and then stick with that and definitely take advantage of those. And the final thing I want to touch on is just kind of some differences between game objects and nodes. Game objects are the kind of building blocks of everything else. So if I go into the player prefab here, you'll notice I have a kind of empty game object. It really just has a transform and a script attached to it. And then below that, you'll have the visual, and you've got the head and the body. And you'll notice on the head and the body, there are different components here. Like you have a mesh renderer, you have a spear, and on the player itself, you also have an animator and things like that. But you'll notice that most of these have some sort of component on them. Meanwhile, in Godot, that's really not quite the way it works. Like you have a node that's a player, and by the way, the player node is a character body 2D. I will show you one more trick with that before we wrap up. But the player, the character body 2D is a node, and the character body 2D, if I go and add a new node, if I search for character body 2D, you'll notice here that I have character body 2D, and it inherits from physics body 2D, which inherits from collision object 2D, a node 2D, canvas item, and node. So if I actually scroll down through my character body 2D sections here, on the right, you'll notice I have player. These are the export variables I have. Then I have character body 2D. These are the properties that I can change on character body 2D. And if I keep going, you'll notice there's a collision object, and then there's a node, and then there's a canvas item, and then there's node 2D rather, and then node. Node is the most basic node version that there is. And it has, as you can see, very few actual properties to it. But as you get further and further and more specific, you start layering these nodes on top of each other, essentially. And those end up kind of being your components. But again, just a different mindset. But just for example, I have here the player character body 2D. That is primarily responsible for just a few things. But if I go down here, I have an animated sprite. I have an animation player. You don't necessarily need an animated sprite. In this case, it worked out for me. That's a different video. Normally, you'd have a sprite if you're going to do 2D, sprite 2D, and then an animation player or something to actually play your animation. But, you know, I needed a particular marker for something that I was doing with this. And then I also added a camera to the player. And I'm going to show you what typically you'll see when we'll add a new scene. I'll show you a couple of things from this. But we also had to add a collision shape so the character can have collisions. If I actually go and I start a new scene and I say I want to start, I'm gonna go character body 2D. Once I click on this, I'm gonna get a character body 2D, and I normally am going to go in and add a camera. It's very common. And then normally go in and add a sprite. And then also, whoops, we wanna do one more thing. I'll talk about that in just a second. And then you probably are also going to want to add a collision shape 2D or a polygon. So you'll notice that I changed that really quick. It's really important about what the parent is over here, which is, again, something that's kind of like Unity. There can be times where you may want a sprite particularly to be the child of something. There may be times where you don't. A lot of times, in Godot, like here. So notice I have a hurt box and a collision shape attached to the hurt box directly. and a hitbox, and then a collision shape attached to that. That is a child of the hitbox, and the hitbox itself is a child of slime. That is just something to keep in mind, is to make sure to pay attention to all of those child relationships, and you kind of have to look more about that and how they're related. And I do plan to do more content on Godot, but this is, again, a very quick overview. The other nice thing that I was going to show you is if you have this character body 2D and you hit create a new script and you let it inherit from character body 2D, it's actually going to give you a very basic controller. So UI accept, UI left, UI right, you can actually already go and jump and move left and right. And you can see what the actual keys are by going to project settings, and then over here to input map. And so the input map is just where you go and set these up. These are stuff that I had set up for my game jam, so I wouldn't actually need to use this UI accept. I could actually just use jump, and that would actually use the jump button that I assigned in the setup there, the input and all that. But yeah, it's just kind of nice that you have a very basic controller to move somebody around if you start up a character. I think that's going to cover it for this video. I actually covered more than I intended to, but I kept seeing things as I was walking through this, and I'm like, I need to tell them about this. I felt like I could have kept going and going and going, but I had to figure out somewhere to cut this off. For me personally, I have not started a project yet, and I feel like at this point, I know Godot decently well from my time with it in the summer, and then, you know, coming back to it now. So I really am leaning strongly into just using Godot and maybe exploring some of the options that Unreal has and just kind of working to understand those. I hope this has been helpful. If you're interested in following my journey into game development, please subscribe, and thanks for watching. Have a great day, and I will see you next time.